to Daniel chapter 10 is where we're going to be spending our time. And I'll get there myself. Now, as we enter into chapter 10, this is another section of this book where we read about Daniel having another message that was revealed to him through a vision. And this is seen in the fact that in verse 1 of this chapter, the text says, "In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who is named Belteshazzar, and the message was true and one of great conflict, but he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision." There's a lot of information in that verse, but as we see in the text, first of all, we have another timeline being established here, and about what happened to Daniel, and he's also called here Belteshazzar. We've run into that information before. That was kind of his Babylonian name that was given. But again, this verse is really a timeline. This is the timeline the author records here would have been around the years 536 or 535 BC, and that's roughly 2 years after the events of chapter 9. Now, I just would like to remind us that when we read our Bibles, we move one verse to the next, one chapter to the next very neatly, but we need to be reminded that even from one chapter to the next, there could be a large span of time, so I got that backwards, that passes. And that's true from chapters 9 and 10 in Daniel. There's about 2 years that have passed between those two chapters. But again, we see here Daniel again being identified as Belteshazzar, and part of the reason the author does that is because, at least a possible reason, is to remind his readers that this is the same Daniel that we've been reading about all throughout the book. Again, just in 10 chapters, a lot of time has passed, and so the author seems to be reminding his readers, this is the same Daniel we've been talking about all throughout this book. But then we have this other information about this message. The text says it was true and one of great conflict, and Daniel had an understanding of that vision. And since that's the case, what we should also know here is that the message and the vision mentioned here, they're not necessarily separate. The message and the vision, they're just two words referring to the same thing. Again, that's a lot of information just in one verse. Questions, comments?
Vision is a message, isn't it?
Yes, and that's kind of the point here. So
they doubled up on it there for some reason.
Right. They did double up on it there for some reason, as you put it, Don. So that's why it's important to know that message and vision, it's referring to the same thing. Because through the vision is something you see, but through that vision, you're also getting a message. And that's been true of the different visions that we've been looking at in Daniel, at least briefly, throughout our study. Any other questions or comments? All right, so what we're studying again is the character of Daniel. And it's here in verse 1 that introduced for us another characteristic of Daniel that we're going to see through the text of verses 1 through 9, or 2 through 9 of this chapter, where we learn more about just what kind of man Daniel was through his response to these things. And we're going to look at 2 points about what kind of man he was. And the first point we'll examine from verses 2 and 3 is that Daniel was a mournful man. And the second point we'll examine from verses 4 through 9 is that he was really a lonely man. And we'll look at that as well. But after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses in terms of application is that there may be times in our lives when we will be like Daniel in this respect. So we'll read verses 2 through 9, and then we'll look at these points. Again, this is Daniel chapter 10. The text says, beginning verse 2 of Daniel 10, "In those days I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were completed. On the 24th day of the first month, while I was by the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my hands and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz, or Uphaz, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But verse 6, his body also was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. Now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. So again, we're looking at what kind of man Daniel was through the text of these verses, and that is that he was a mournful man. Now, I think we begin to see that there in verse 2. What was Daniel doing there in verse 2? I mean, he was mourning for how long? 3 weeks. Now, what is mourning? Let's ask that question. Okay, but when you're in a state of mourning, what does that mean? You're grieving. So, sadness, a very deep kind of sadness. And we'll talk about what Elaine just mentioned here in just a minute, but why do we grieve? What are the circumstances when we're in that state of grieving? Commonly, it's a great loss. There's been some great tragedy that has happened in our lives. Now, that's part of what Daniel has been dealing with. He and his fellow Jews have been in this state of captivity for many years, and that's part of the reason he's mourning. But the text also says, as we've noticed, how long he's been in this state of mourning, and that's for 3 entire weeks, and that's going to carry forward into verse 3. Questions or comments on verse 2?
Daniel obviously rose to great esteem.
Yeah.
Rulers in his first portion of time he was in that land. Do we know whether he was in high esteem to the various rulers or not?
Under Persian, when the Persians were ruling, they were. I don't remember where he was. I'm trying to remember what specific verse speaks to that, because we've obviously been skipping. He did have a good reputation with the Persian ruler as well. His name was Cyrus, and that we see in verse 1. I'm just trying to remember what specific verse talks about how he rose to that occasion.
So he may have been in high esteem and honor throughout the time he was there.
Yeah. Yeah, throughout almost the entire captivity, he remained in good standing. Elaine? Exactly. Yeah, sorry. Lost my words there. Yes, that mourning is an aspect that all has to do with the captivity. They're away from their homeland, and there have been several decades. I'm not going to say several hundred years, because that's not the case, but several decades that have passed that this is going on. And part of Daniel's knowledge is he knows Jerusalem has been destroyed, especially including the temple. And that's all part of this mourning process. Back in chapter 9, we talked about how he read in the prophet Jeremiah that this was going to last for roughly 70 years. And that's why I say several decades. It wasn't going to go on for 100 years. And here in chapter 10, we're just a few years away from them beginning to go back. And even the process has even begun of them going back here by chapter 10 of Daniel. And we don't read about the return in detail here in Daniel, but we do read about it in Ezra and Nehemiah. Good points. Anything else on verse 2?
Just one more thing, kind of that. In a lot of cases, it would just be the children of the people who were taken captivity. Because probably many of the original people were not, passed away from it.
Yeah, that would be the case. Just for example, it's believed that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by Daniel chapter 10 are probably already dead at this point. And that's just some conjecture. We're not told that.
They still live on, at that time, they're still living 160 to 180 years. It's not like it is today. They're still living to a lot older age. Because even during the time of Christ, 100 years was the average.
Right.
So they could be dead. They just may not be mentioned because of the fact they're no longer vital to the story.
Exactly. Yeah. That's also true.
When they're out of captivity, there's probably still a ton of people going back that left that were in captivity when they went back.
Right. So,
Not just the children.
and we have to remember that Daniel, at the beginning of the book, he was a teenager. By the time we reach chapter 10, he's probably somewhere in his 80s. That's how much time has passed just in those 10 chapters. So, anything else on verse 2? Okay. So verse 3, we learn what Daniel was doing or not doing during those 3 weeks that he was in mourning. What does verse 3 tell us? And what do we call that? When you're not eating meats and not drinking anything, what do we call that? Fasting. And this comes back to Elaine's point. We don't see the sackcloth and ashes in this verse, but there's some fasting going on. But what else does the verse tell us? Did not anoint himself either, any ointment. What is ointment? That's true. We see evidence of that. Okay. So he's neglecting his dietary needs, but what else is he neglecting? His physical appearance. This ointment and these things we read at the end of the verse, these are things that have to do with his physical appearance. So he's in bad shape, all because he's in mourning over what's going on. And this, again, as we've seen in the text, this is just going on for a period of 3 weeks. 3 entire weeks, Daniel says. So it's here where we're beginning to see that one of the characteristics of Daniel that's revealed in this book is that he was a mournful man. Questions or comments on verse 3? Right.
Got them together, there was a different diet that they wanted them to be under, and they said they would rather not.
Right.
That diet would let us do this other diet, which was vegetarian.
True. It was vegetables and water,
So
basically.
They were,
Yeah.
so for 3 weeks he's not had choice food, meat, or wine, so apparently his diet has changed.
That's a good observation. Yeah.
Doing those things, but so the diet has changed somewhat through the years. But
Yeah, that's true. And I honestly hadn't made that observation. It's a good observation to make.
personally, I don't see this as this is not totally fasting, but he's giving up some of those of the choice things, but he's still
Yeah,
eating. It's not like Jesus fasting for 40 days out in the wilderness,
true.
but he is giving up some of the pleasantries
That's true.
of life.
That is true. Good observation. Anything else on verse 3? All right. So again, verses 2 and 3 reveal something about Daniel, that he was a mournful man. He was a man of mourning because of some of the circumstances he faced. He fasted in that process, and he went so far as to neglect his personal appearance. And all these things Daniel did because he understood the seriousness of the things that were going to be revealed and things that had been revealed before this point. So that brings us into verses 4 through 9. We're going to look at the second point about who Daniel was, and that is that he was a lonely man, and we'll see that a little later in these verses. But here in verse 4, we have another timeline as well as a location of where he was when these things that are going to be told were about to occur. So he tells us first that this was on the 24th day of the first month. Now, he's operating on the Jewish calendar here. This isn't January 24th that he's talking about. This is the Jewish calendar. And the date he mentions here is somewhere around the months of March or April, closer to springtime. And since that's true, something else we should understand here is that the timeline Daniel gives here would be the end of the 3 weeks that he just mentioned. But then we have a location. The location, as the text says, is the Tigris River, which puts Daniel somewhere away from the capital of the Persian Empire. So he's away from the capital where he would normally be working for the king. Now that's just some brief information there on verse 4. Any questions, comments? Are you talking about verse 4?
Yeah.
How does yours read?
Hiddekel.
Okay, let me see if I have a footnote about that. Verse 5. Yeah, it's Hiddekel. The Hebrew term is Hiddekel. So I'm glad you pointed that out. I just missed that footnote. So thank you, Blake, for clarifying that for us. It's another name for the Tigris River. I see that now in my footnote. Anything else on verse 4? Okay. So going to verse 5, Daniel lifts his eyes, and what does he see? A certain man. How's he look? Belt of fine gold. So, what's he looking at? Probably an angel. But once again, appearing in human form. Very well dressed. This linen, the linen is, the text doesn't say specifically, but it's probably white. And so he's probably seeing an angel appearing in human form. But the appearance, as far as the clothing, the physical appearance of it, it's giving off that this angel is both pure and authoritative in his nature, coming with the authority of God, we might say. Anything else on verse 5?
Go to Revelation chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. It's the identical image, and it was Christ that John saw. So
True.
it wasn't Christ. What do we actually think?
We're not sure, but it could be. Because, yes, okay, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent. I promise you I'll come back. When you put Daniel and Revelation side by side, a lot of similarities between the two books. It's been said that Revelation is a commentary on Daniel and vice versa. That's how similar they are. And this is one instance where they're similar. Some of these angels that appear are similar in appearance to some of the angels or even Jesus that we read about in Revelation. Okay, I'm off my tangent. Let's go ahead, Sandy. And yes, we will get to that, because sometimes God himself can appear as an angel. We have this angel of the Lord individual in Scripture. It's been said that that's God appearing in angelic form, but that's a different study. Any other questions or comments on verse 5? Okay, verse 6, the description continues. What else are we told about his appearance there in verse 6? So what does that tell us about this angel? It's scary to look at. Amazing to look at. And he had a loud voice. Okay. Right. So this is continuing to talk about the authority of this angelic being, this certain man, or this angel appears as this certain man. Again, this is just a further description of this angel. I don't want to get bogged down in the details of it. Any other questions or comments on verse 6? True. That can be the case. And yeah. In a lot of cases, these angels do appear in this way. But in other cases, they don't. We think of Abraham. We had those angels who came to him, but they looked like regular human beings. So it's different throughout different angelic instances, or appearances, I should say. Anything else on verse 6? All right, verse 7, what does Daniel tell us? He's the only one that saw it. So this tells us that there were other people with Daniel, but Daniel's the only one that saw it. Exactly, they sensed something. Saw and probably the only one that heard. Let me ask you this, does that remind you of something we read about in the New Testament? That happened to someone? Saul. Very similar circumstance. They're on the road to Damascus. He's got all this people with him. Jesus appears. Saul/Paul is the only one who saw it. Very big comparison here to that. And the men traveling with them, they did not necessarily leave, but they still felt that presence. That's what's going on here. Daniel's the only one that saw it. But what do these men do? They leave. They leave Daniel alone. Anything else on verse 7? Okay. So they leave Daniel alone. That's brought out in verse 8. And what happens next when Daniel's alone? No strength was left in him, and what else happened to him? What about his physical appearance? Face lost all of its color. Deathly pallor is how the New American Standard puts it. And he became weak. So he became weak, and he turned what we might call as white as a ghost. All because of this vision that he's seeing, and because of the fear he probably had within him. And then we reach verse 9. That's the last thing that happens. So he basically collapses at this point. Now Jeremiah brought out the comparison to Revelation here. This is also a similarity to something we read in Revelation. John sees Jesus appearing the way that he does. And in Revelation 1:17, John says he fell at his feet like a dead man. That's what's happening here. Daniel collapses to the point of becoming unconscious, all because he was in the presence of this being who is probably more than an angel, but may have been God himself in human form. But Daniel was alone at this point. So what this tells us as far as Daniel is that he was a lonely man. A lot of these things that he's experienced throughout this book, he experienced them by himself. So what we should be reminded of is that in many of these visions, Daniel saw he was completely alone. So that's what made him a lonely man, that only he saw these visions, received these revelations from God. That carries back in the morning. He knew things other people did not because he was alone in these visions. Dean, go ahead. That might be true. The other people might not have understood it the way Daniel did. So when we put all these verses that we've looked at together, I think the point, if we're going to make this point, is that Daniel was a man like Jesus. Jesus mourned. Jesus was lonely in a lot of respects. As far as application goes, is there will be times when we are like Daniel. There will be times where we will be mournful at the condition of God's people. There will be times when we will be lonely in our relationship with God. But even though that's the case, we should remember that Jesus often felt this way in his ministry. There were times that Jesus mourned at the condition of God's people. There were times that he felt lonely in his relationship with God, and that's especially true at the cross. And so when we experience these feelings of mournfulness and loneliness, we can remember that Jesus also experienced them. Many of God's people of the past also experienced them. Any other questions or comments? Go ahead, Doug.
Daniel didn't react a whole lot differently than these other people did. They were terrified, he was terrified.
Right.
He just didn't run away.
He didn't run away. So that's a good point. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Right. He experienced a lot of things other people did not. Blake, go ahead.
One thing I found interesting as we've gone through the book and these various spiritual encounters, it always mentions through several verses how he's, confused and striving to understand and doesn't understand what he's seeing. And then in verse 1 this time, it's sure to mention that he does understand.
Right.
I just thought it was an interesting comparison that we follow him through his whole life, and, at this point in this journey, his mission, essentially, it's at this time he understands all the others.
Yeah, it's a good point to make. This is one of the first verses we see where he had an understanding before it had to be explained to him. So, anything else on what we've studied today? All right. Don, will you close us today?